If, God forbid, there ever was a nuclear war, how do you think it might occur? By inadvertence or by cold-blooded aggression?
It'll be, to use your word, the result of inadvertence. We'll bungle into it.
I think it's very unlikely that we would ever bungle into nuclear war.
We've become able to build systems of a complexity we can no longer control.
Yeah, this is rubbish. This is one of the great mindless cliches about technology.
If we go on with this madness long enough, we're going to inevitably have an accidental nuclear war.
Go. Okay, we're go. Hang tight. We're go.
All of us know that in spite of our best intentions and the most elaborate safeguards, accidents are an inevitable part of human affairs. We also know that the more complex the machine or system, the more parts there are that can fail. Experience tells us that in spite of the most sophisticated tests and procedures we are able to design, things can go wrong. Things can go out of control, and sometimes do. Hello, I'm Bill Curtis. As a reporter, I sometimes have to describe accidents and catastrophes which could have been avoided if proper precautions had been taken. And I often wish there were some way I could play a part in preventing these tragedies from ever happening in the future. That's why I'm here to introduce a program about a subject that most of us would rather not even think about, one that we all pray will never be part of any news broadcast. The possibility that nuclear war could start by accident, or to be more exact, that we could blunder into it. If that war does start, this is the place from which the word would go out to launch the planes, to launch the nuclear missiles. It's the command center of the Strategic Air Command, or SAC, outside Omaha, Nebraska, and 3 stories underground. Like the tragedies I've reported on in the past, accidental nuclear war can be avoided, or the risk at least substantially lessened, if precautions are taken. But before we can do that, we must understand the hows and whys that could cause that fatal blunder. This will not be a program about the scope of the horror and the devastation. You've seen those programs before. This program asks the questions, could we actually lose control of the nuclear game? And how? And what can we do to prevent it?
Skybird, this is a properly authenticated execution message from the National Command Authority. Execute the emergency war order.
We're now into our 5th decade since we began the nuclear arms race, since we developed and used the first 2 nuclear weapons, and we haven't had a nuclear war yet. But we've come close on several occasions. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, when President Kennedy estimated the chances of nuclear war with the Soviets to be close to 50-50. And not long ago, national polls showed over half of Americans believing deterrence would one day fail and nuclear war would happen by accident. On the other hand, most of us want to believe that the incredible destructiveness of these weapons will guarantee they will never be used again. The question can rightly be asked, who in their right mind would ever purposely bring on the end of civilization, and possibly all human life on this planet? The answer we would all like to believe is that no one would. And yet, in the opinion of a growing body of experts, we may in fact be asking the wrong question. What are the chances that someone in a wrong mind, or perhaps given wrong information under pressure, could make mistakes that could lead to an unintended or inadvertent nuclear exchange? According to these experts, this has now actually become the more likely path to nuclear war. But today, there's a new optimism in the air. There are important changes in Moscow and important changes in Washington. And in this atmosphere, 3 very different solutions are emerging by which the nuclear threat might be seriously diminished and even totally eliminated. Some people are proposing that we should try to build a defensive shield against them. Others say we should much more radically reduce the numbers to as small as 50 nuclear weapons on each side, which would be relatively invulnerable to attack, based in submarines, for example. And still others are concerned about the potential destructiveness of even this lower number of weapons and hold out a vision of total abolition, including the means to build them. At the Reykjavik meeting with the Russians, President Reagan actually agreed with the total elimination solution, and that wasn't the only time either. Only the president's refusal to give up SDI prevented what might have been the most significant agreement in mankind's history. Which of these solutions is the most feasible? Which is the safest? Could any of them make matters more dangerous? And instead of looking just at the bombs, should we also be looking at the fuses, at our third world entanglements that might someday act as nuclear tripwires, at our war-fighting doctrines, and at other nations who have or soon will have nuclear weapons? In order to answer these questions, we think it would be a good idea to see for the first time just exactly how a nuclear war could start, how one thing could lead to another, and that final blunder could happen. If we did blunder into the next World War, it wouldn't be the first time. History tells us wars have often begun as a result of accidents or blunders. World War I is only the most recent example.
In all of the conditions that led to the First World War are present now. You've got the alliances that link all the great nations together, or you've got the arms race to create both the suspicion and fear, and you have got the war plans, the half-understood war plans that, in fact, will be much more automatic than you imagine once you set them into motion. The psychology of human beings certainly hasn't changed. The unwillingness of people who've made a decision to unmake it, even if they find it's leading them where they had no desire to go in the middle of a crisis. And on top of all that, we've got a problem they didn't have in 1914. Technical error, technical misinformation as a possible source of crisis, or as a possible way of moving the crisis along very fast. Very frightening. I don't think we're a bit safer. I mean, one of the things that people forget about 1914 is that it was a period rather like now, when everything seemed to be settling down, the great powers were talking to each other. It was a good time. I mean, everything was looking up.
And so this business of blundering into nuclear war doesn't seem so theoretical. We're going to create a plausible scenario that takes us step by step through a series of events that could lead to that final mistake. Every once in a while, we'll stop the crisis to hear some comment on it from our experts, and you'll be able to draw some relevant conclusions of your own. And now, here it is, our plausible crisis.
Day 1. At 3:30 this morning Eastern Standard Time, planes of the Syrian Air Force attacked the Golan Heights. Throughout the day, Syrian MiGs attacked other locations in Israel, apparently in retaliation for Israel's attack on Syrian territory and last week's accidental downing of a Syrian airliner that killed 316 passengers.
Day 2, 8 a.m.
Even in this second day of fighting, Israel asked the State Department for an urgent resupply of military equipment. There is no word yet on how or when the U.S. will reply.
Day 3, 6 p.m.
At a Soviet press conference today, General Secretary Gorbachev said the Soviet Union would do everything in its power to prevent Syrian defeat at the hands of Israel. Gorbachev warned the United States not to resupply Israel and asked the U.S. to join instead in a push for an immediate ceasefire.
People think that we're out of the woods now, and it'd be nice to believe that the Cold War is, after all, over. The Soviet government and the American government are collaborating all over the place. Why worry? Well, I would like not to worry. But there are two reasons that we should still worry a bit. One is that the Soviet Union is in the middle of a huge internal transformation, and all sorts of things could go off the rails. There could be a coup, there could be civil war. You don't know for certain yet. The other thing is that even with President Gorbachev in control, and the present government in the Soviet Union and in the United States, it's entirely possible for these countries to stumble into a confrontation. They both have the reflexes and the instincts of great powers. Once you find yourself in a situation of confrontation, the conflict can escalate in the same old way, even without the Cold War. I don't think we should count our chickens yet.
When we used to think about nuclear war, we thought first of the United States and the Soviet Union. Historically, however, the fuse was lit in the Third World, when we or the Soviets intervened militarily. If at some future date there is a change for the worse in the Soviet leadership, and they get involved with the United States again in a Third World crisis, how easy will it be to prevent that crisis from escalating?
Generally, people think that it's fairly easy for the United States and the Soviet Union either to prevent a war, to control its escalation, or to stop it once it gets going, when these wars occur in the Third World. In fact, the evidence suggests quite to the contrary. Once the war begins, the Soviet Union and the United States get drawn in to a process of escalation. One side begins the military resupply effort, the other responds because it feels that it's being challenged, that its reputation is at stake, not only with respect to the other superpower, but with respect to members of the Third World. It's very difficult for the Soviet Union and the United States to get together in the midst of a war and cooperate on controlling the process of escalation.
Day 3, 9 p.m.
The House and Senate unanimously passed resolutions today stating that any Soviet interference in the Israeli-Syrian war will not be tolerated by the United States, and further, that the United States will not allow an Israeli defeat. Despite recent improvements in relations between Washington and Moscow, many members of Congress and outside experts fear a superpower confrontation could result from the current Mideast crisis.
Day 4, 8:15 a.m.
Checking the headlines, according to Pentagon sources, major airlifts supported by U.S. fighters are now en route to meet Israel's urgent need for equipment and ammunition.
10 a.m.
A Department of the Navy spokesman reported that Soviet and U.S. warships and submarines are rapidly steaming toward the eastern Mediterranean today. The spokesman said as many as 50 Soviet and 40 U.S. surface ships and submarines could be monitoring each other in the eastern Mediterranean within the next few days.
6:05 p.m.
The Pentagon announced that 2 United States transport aircraft were shot down this morning by Soviet-built ground-to-air missiles launched from Syrian missile sites. We hear now from Bill Whitman in Tel Aviv with more details.
Within 2 hours after the downing of the transports, U.S. warplanes from the aircraft carrier Nimitz retaliated by attacking and destroying the Syrian missile sites. Diplomatic sources in Damascus report that several Soviet advisors were killed in the attacks. Meanwhile, Israeli forces have advanced against Syrian positions in Lebanon. Fighting is reported to be heavy. Reports from Washington and Moscow indicate both superpowers have placed their forces in the area on heightened alert.
Now a classic military doctrine comes into play. Worst case point of view. It means that when two enemies look at each other's actions in a crisis situation, each assumes the worst militarily and therefore takes the strongest action to protect himself. That's always been the sound military logic, at least until we started the nuclear game.
If you make the assumption that the forces arrayed against you are less than they turn out to be, you can get wiped out. Military commanders are going to be risk averse, and therefore they will assume the worst so that they can deal with situations that they may face. It's a perfectly rational way to face the unknown.
This worst case point of view can trigger something called the interactive alert, or mirroring dynamic. Your adversary takes some action. He might be trying to protect himself, but since you must assume the worst, you view the action as preparation for an attack. So you take an action to defend yourself. The safety catches are beginning to switch off.
And the danger is that we may, take off the safety catches just as a preventive step. But if the Soviets see us taking off the safety catches, they say that's not a defensive action. They're getting ready to strike us. And they decide, well, they will remove some of the safety catches from their weapons. And we say, gee, we shouldn't just take off some of the safety catches. We should take them all off because we're ready to go. And here you have a situation where both sides are being prudent, but they end up being provocative.
And it's not always obvious what the intentions are when one observes preparations underway. This happened in 1973 during the Yom Kippur War, where the Soviets went on alert. They began moving forces. There was a point at which it looked as though nuclear weapons were being moved into the region. In situations like that, you get both sides turning to alert status because forces, ours anyway, are potentially vulnerable to preemptive attack. And it may all be a miscalculation, but it can produce consequences nevertheless.
Day 5, 8 a.m.
Reports from Israel late last night of chemical weapons again being fired from across the Syrian border into northern Israel, some landing in urban areas, causing extensive civilian casualties. Syria is now threatening to launch chemical attacks against major urban areas in Israel. 2 hours later, Israeli warplanes struck the Syrian capital of Damascus. Details now from Sam Michelson in Damascus.
Diplomatic sources in Damascus say casualties are heavy from the midday raid. Syrian sources report that thousands of people have died, and Syria's President al-Assad is promising relentless revenge for this senseless slaughter.
8:30 a.m.
Within the hours, Syria has made good on its threat and launched Soviet-made chemical warheads against Tel Aviv. Thousands of civilian casualties have been reported. We hear more on this developing story now from Bill Whitman in Tel Aviv. Bill?
The sour smell of death lingers over the Israeli city of Tel Aviv tonight. Syrian forces have sent scores of chemical and conventional missiles into the city, Deaths are estimated in the thousands. In Tel Aviv, Israel's prime minister has told reporters that Syria will suffer the ultimate retaliation, possibly referring to the use of nuclear weapons.
Secretary General Gorbachev of the Soviet Union says that any use of nuclear weapons by Israel will, in his words, prompt an immediate Soviet response.
Administration sources say U.S. forces have increased their alert status around the world. These sources say the move is merely precautionary, and they expect the Soviet Union to take similar precautionary action.
In essence, we are witnessing a repeat of what happened during the Arab-Israeli War of 1973. The United States went on a nuclear alert then as well. But if some of you are still wondering how likely the events in our crisis are, consider this.
I can't tell you precisely how it might come about, but I do know that the scenarios one least anticipates have sometimes turned out to be the case. I'm told, for example, that a group of people responsible for designing war games so that we can try to think these things through well in advance, in the early 1960s, had among the candidate scenarios one that began with the introduction of Soviet missiles into Cuba. And it was rejected by the committee reviewing these scenarios as too outlandish, too unrealistic. So you can never tell what might develop in the chaotic situation of military activity, even of a limited nature.
Day 5, 10 p.m.
Moments ago, Israel launched a nuclear missile against Syria. We hear more now on this story from Bill Whitman in Tel Aviv.
Israel's defense minister Shamir says the nuclear missile hit a military target outside the capital city of Damascus, and he warns that other warheads will be launched unless Syria agrees to an immediate ceasefire. Israeli sources said their nuclear strike was a preemptive one due to fears that Syria was on the verge of getting its own nuclear weapon.
10:30 p.m.
According to a Pentagon source, U.S. forces worldwide have gone on nuclear alert today, the first time since the 1973 Mideast War.
You know, this scenario has a lot of elements in it that some of your viewers may find a little hard to imagine, but it's not difficult to imagine. When you have all these chemical weapons now available in the Middle East among Israel's adversaries, and they all now have, or are soon going to have, missiles able to hit Israel, and this is quite a number of countries, Israel has to figure out how it's going to respond to this new threat. And the way they are responding is, for the first time, to hint at nuclear retaliation.
In our third world crisis involving the superpowers, the first nuclear explosion occurred in a third world country. But what if that nuclear explosion, or the next one, had occurred in just one major American city, such as Washington, or in just one major Soviet city, such as Moscow?
Well, if you had an attack on an American city with a nuclear weapon of unknown origin, what do? How do you respond? Do you assume it's from the Soviet Union? Does the Soviet Union assume that we will think it is from the Soviet Union, and therefore they go on alert in anticipation of a retaliatory strike that we might not have it in mind to make? A nuclear event of almost any kind is going to create an instant crisis with unpredictable results.
As our crisis develops, much of the data on these events is picked up by U.S. and Soviet satellites and transmitted almost instantaneously to the Soviet Early Warning Center and our counterpart deep inside Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado. It's called NORAD, or North American Aerospace Defense Command, and it's the pivotal organization through which all this information flows. NORAD's deputy commander is Admiral William Ramsey.
We have a system of satellites that detect the infrared energy from rockets or missiles that are launched around the world. They are the primary warning indication of any launch. Our secondary line of warning is a system of radar sites that are located around the periphery of the United States. They provide us the initial information. We're here in the command post, the North American Aerospace Defense Command Post. The command director can make an assessment as to the character and the nature of that particular event. The command director's assessment is made in a very short period of time. That assessment is passed forward to the authorities in Washington and Ottawa. The National Military Command Center in the Pentagon takes that assessment, contacts the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and if they so decide, the President of the United States, and those individuals will make the determination as to what action the United States should take. The execution of our retaliatory strike would be conducted by the Strategic Air Command and by our other nuclear commanders and chiefs.
11 p.m.
Next in our scenario, NORAD receives a computer warning of a massive Soviet missile attack against North America. However, the attack seems much larger than would be expected, larger than the numbers of missiles we know the Soviets have. A technical error is suspected. Under great pressure, the American leaders must decide within 3 to 5 minutes whether it is an actual attack or if it is indeed a technical failure. True to the interactive alert dynamic, a wing of our bombers is sent aloft as a precautionary measure. And when this is detected by Soviet satellites, they evacuate their leadership from Moscow. And now we come to another factor, technical fallibility. Our side now calls a threat assessment conference, consisting of the commander-in-chief at the Strategic Air Command, the commander of NORAD, and the National Command Authority, including the Secretary of Defense and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. These men alone must also decide what advice to give the President as to whether or not to retaliate, and when. The conference must be over in about 4 minutes. A submarine-launched ballistic missile off our shore could wipe out the Pentagon and Washington in as little as 6 minutes. That means there's almost no time for the President to make his decision, assuming you can find and communicate with him without delay, and assuming you know what you're responding to. By the way, in our scenario, the President got away in time onto his plane. But what if the plane leaves without him? That actually happened to President Carter in a nuclear attack simulation exercise in 1979. Fortunately, the warning in our scenario turns out to be false, the result of a faulty 49-cent computer chip. And luckily, it was discovered in time. Like most of the events in our scenario, this event also happened before, in 1980. There have been many others, even more bizarre. Years earlier, a flock of Canada geese actually fooled our early warning radar into thinking it was a swarm of Soviet warheads headed straight for the United States. Often the problem is operator error, as in 1979, when an officer accidentally inserted a training tape simulating a Soviet nuclear attack into the real nuclear warning system instead of the training system.
False indications of attack are actually very common. Between 77 and 84, there were over 20,000 false indications of incoming missile attack on the U.S. early warning system, of which about 1,000 were serious enough that they had to take a second look, as it were. They didn't instantly dismiss it. Since 84, they haven't published numbers anymore, but in fact the situation's got worse. The system is more sensitive and provides more false indications. And of course the Russians have the same problem. It's not just 1,000 false indications that are taken seriously on the American early warning system. There's probably 1,000 or more on the Russian as well. And some of these actually get very serious. There was one on the U.S. early warning system in '79 that took 6 minutes to resolve before they were sure that they didn't have a missile attack underway. They were revving up B-52 bombers on the end of runways. I think some tactical nuclear weapons-carrying aircraft actually got off the ground.
Back in 1979 and in 1980, we had a number of events. An extensive upgrade of our systems was undertaken, which have reinforced our confidence that today we would never have a technical event that would cause us to alert any of our authorities falsely or based on incorrect information that there is an attack against the North American continent. I just don't think it could happen.
It simply isn't correct to say these things can't happen. They do happen. We see that it's impossible to anticipate these things. Say air traffic control, for example, or banking, or credit management, and things of that sort. I mean, definitely to include military systems here. You can say, okay, we're going to fix the tape thing. Well, that, of course, makes the whole thing more complicated. And then the additional complication can have a side effect that you don't anticipate, and so on.
The thrust of improvements here in the command center and in the Cheyenne Mountain Complex, and indeed throughout our early warning system, is to improve the redundancy, the robustness of the system. In other words, to ensure that there is not a single point of failure.
Then you have the possibility of failure here, and a failure there, and a failure there, interact in a way that nobody anticipated. And they go around safety devices. They eliminate them, or they avoid the buffers that we've set up there to protect them. And that's what bothers me about large systems. Now, I see the nuclear weapons system as being very complex and tightly coupled and prone to accidents because it resembles a number of other systems that I've studied. Nuclear power plants, chemical plants, air traffic control, These are systems with even less complexity than the nuclear weapons system and even less tight coupling, and they have accidents that nobody could predict and nobody can understand when they're taking place.
I am confident that we would never have a technical event that would cause us to alert any of our authorities falsely. I just don't think it could happen. There are too many checks and balances in the system.
The problem here is that the super high-tech information processing technology gives you a ridiculous false sense of security. Big systems, complex systems, systems where everything, and it looks beautiful on paper, is highly integrated, has failure possibilities beyond the wildest belief.
No matter how hard you try, no matter how much money you put into it, the best engineers and the best talent, like the space program, it still had system accidents. You cannot prevent them.
Since 1980, over $30 billion has been spent to improve our strategic command, control, and communication system. In spite of this, in 1984, the Department of Defense stopped making public the numbers of serious false missile attack warnings. So we asked Admiral Ramsey, in view of this investment, have in fact, yes or no, the numbers of false missile attack warnings per year gone down since '84?
No, I think they've probably gone up. We have not touched on the activity that we experience, but on an annual basis, we are actually having increased activity each year, actual activity. As far as the young men and women in the Missile Warning Center are concerned, when they get an event, that could be an attack against North America. And so they treat it just like they would an actual event in war.
A6, 11:30 p.m.
This just in, Secretary of Defense Richard Cheney has been hospitalized with what doctors call an apparent heart attack. The Secretary of Defense was rushed to George Washington Hospital from a White House meeting moments ago.
Beyond the technical fallibility we've been talking about lies the factor of human fallibility. On this sixth day, one thing is certain. Exhaustion is beginning to set in for the decision makers, and also for those all the way down the chain of command. And the experts tell us that a lot of studies show that decisions made without enough time to decide are almost always worse than no decisions at all. When you stop to think of it, what could be more stressful than drifting toward nuclear war?
People fire papers at you, cables come in, intelligence reports. Pretty soon, you just put them away because you can't handle everything new. Eventually, you get closure. Groupthink. It means the pressures for consensus around the table become such that you begin to block out alternatives. And that can be dangerous because you want someone to get up and jump up and down and say, wait a minute, maybe it's a bad idea, without being kicked out. I can't think of a worse prescription for making World War III out of an ambiguous and possibly unreal series of threats in a crisis.
Agreements are based on assumptions of rationality. The forces are structured on assumptions of rationality. And this may be the area where we all go horribly wrong. I mean, you don't know how people are going to behave in a crisis.
In moments of crises, political and military leaders are neither coolly rational nor well-informed. They're swept in a fog of battle. It's a function of misjudgment, miscalculation, misinformation, human fallibility. And under those circumstances, there's a very great danger indeed that command and control would be distorted by misinformation, miscalculation. That's the danger.
We now have a big investment in communications, equipment, and computers that help us to make decisions. What worries me is that the human being at the end of the line has got the same old equipment between the ears.
Now, in peacetime, with no crisis on, the presumption will be that a false indication is indeed a false indication. No panic, we'll sort it out. In a crisis, it's going to be very different. People are going to be prepared to believe that a false indication is real.
I'm talking, of course, referring to the 508-point crash of the stock market that we had back in last October. It's absolutely the closest analogy I've seen to the War Games movie. It's madness. Nobody has any understanding of what the causes are, what triggered the thing in the first place. And so what you see is all kinds of crazy knee-jerk reactions that are the worst possible way that anybody could possibly react. You see all kinds of panic reactions, half the people overkilling, half the people underkilling, a third of the people paralyzed.
Beyond normal human fallibility under pressure, There's the danger of drug and other medical problems among top decision makers, and also among the men and women who man the bombs, problems that can become far more pronounced at times of intense stress.
Survey of the U.S. military in 1980 indicated that there was a very high incidence of drug usage. Up to 19% indicated that they were actually high while working. During the 10 years from 1975 to 1985, fully 50,000 individuals were disaffiliated, were separated from all of the 112,000 individuals in the U.S. military who are responsible for nuclear weapons use. What that means is that at any one point in time, there are 5,000 in the military responsible for nuclear weapons who are unstable and who are under the influence of drugs or alcohol, or who may be psychiatrically in great difficulty.
Day 8, 8 p.m.
This surprise development from the Mediterranean.
There's been an exchange of fire between U.S. and Soviet naval vessels. Unconfirmed reports are that the USS New York has been hit by a Soviet missile. Details are still sketchy at this point, but it appears now that the U.S. has retaliated and hit the Soviet attack submarine Ivanov with a torpedo or with a depth charge, and the Ivanov has suffered severe damage.
15 minutes later.
We have here an unconfirmed, I repeat, an unconfirmed report of a nuclear explosion in the eastern Mediterranean. All international phone lines are out to both Israel and Syria, apparently disabled by the electromagnetic effects of the blast. Both U.S. and Soviet submarines are in the area, and U.S. intelligence sources believe one of their submarine commanders may have mistakenly fired a missile or a torpedo with a nuclear warhead.
The first nuclear exchange between the U.S. and the USSR. Will it lead to further escalation? And also, how did it happen in the first place? We don't know the answer to either question. All we are told is that only the president can authorize it. But could a commander at sea fire a nuclear weapon without the president's authorization?
Nuclear weapons that are held by the Army and the Air Force have safety devices associated with them that prevent the weapon from being launched unless they have a direct order from the president. This safety device does not exist on nuclear weapons at sea. If the commanding officer of a ship wanted to release nuclear weapons before they were authorized, he could do that with as few as 3 people scheming with him to achieve that goal. Now, in a wartime situation, however, where there is actually a war going on, I think it'd be possible for the captain to use his nuclear weapons without anybody else agreeing with him. In other words, he could come to the crew and say, look, there's a war on. We have these weapons, we would use them. We want to use them, let's use them. And they would. After all, we've had them for many, many years. Everybody's been trained in how to use them. Some of those people have been trained in how to use them and want to use them. We don't know, of course, what the situation is in reference to the Soviet nuclear weapons, whether they have a similar safety device. The Soviet commander may be using his nuclear weapons when he wants to, so why shouldn't the American commander use his nuclear weapons when he wants to?
8:50 p.m.
NATO forces and U.S. strategic forces worldwide have gone to DEFCON, or Defense Condition 2, the highest condition of nuclear alert. This is the first time the United States has raised its alert level this high since the Cuban Missile Crisis. DEFCON 2 is the final stage before all-out nuclear war.
Intelligence sources on Capitol Hill say that satellite photography presented during a briefing by National Security Agency officials indicate that the alert status of Soviet troops has been heightened once again.
According to an unofficial source, NATO commanders have now requested permission to move remaining Pershing II missiles and tactical nuclear weapons from their storage locations.
The danger of losing control of nuclear weapons is not restricted to the seas, though nuclear weapons are more tightly controlled on land. That situation may not be much safer during the fog of war.
Unfortunately, NATO's nuclear weapons, many of them in Europe, on the ground, if we did have to fire one of them, we would be in a lot of kind of intense pressure. Our generals would be. If there was a tank invasion from the other side, they would be under a lot of pressure to ask for the release authority of those nuclear weapons very quickly, because they would think, number one, it's going to take a while for the commander-in-chief to make up his mind, so we better ask now. If we're going to need them 3 days from now, we better ask right now.
I'm not concerned about the centralized control over American nuclear weapons. I think we have our own nuclear weapons under extremely tight control.
When I was studying and advising at highest levels on command and control in the late 50s, the fact is that the president had at that time, contrary to assurances given to the U.S. public, delegated the authority to use nuclear weapons to lower commanders, field commanders, in the event that communications should be cut off from Washington. Is that still the case today? The Pentagon won't say, and the White House won't say. The fact that they won't deny that this delegation has occurred tells me that for the same reasons as occurred 30 years ago, that delegation is still in place today.
My guidance from my political authorities is that you will, before you lose the cohesiveness of your conventional defense, request the release of nuclear weapons. Not you may request, you will request the release of those nuclear weapons.
And what I don't think the average American understands is that our strategy, the NATO strategy, calls for initiating the use of those nuclear weapons under certain circumstances. Recent polls showed that 80% of the Americans believe that nuclear weapons would never be used by the U.S. except in response to a Soviet nuclear strike. They'd be shocked to learn they're wrong. They'd be horrified.
We're still on hold. The question now is whether either side would go beyond this first nuclear exchange and cross the nuclear abyss. According to most experts, it could happen. One way is through the loss of communications to a U.S. or Soviet submarine commander after a single nuclear weapon explosion.
In a nuclear environment where you've had a nuclear explosion, such as in your scenario, and you have an effect that's known as electromagnetic pulse, which could destroy all radios, receivers in the area. So the captain of the ship no longer has any radio receivers, no way to receive a message. He would be concerned that the president is trying to reach him, the president is trying to tell him to launch his nuclear weapons. And that would make it much more likely that he would launch his nuclear weapons on his own. I think the important thing here is that when you don't have any standard procedures, no requirement that you get a message from the president, no physical requirement that there be a message from the president, what you're dealing with is the personalities of a lot of different commanding officers under very tense situations, and where most of them might not launch their nuclear weapons, a few of them might, or one of them might, and that would be all that would be necessary.
But assuming that U.S. and Soviet commanders remain calm and in control after that first nuclear explosion in our scenario, wouldn't both sides know it would be suicide to escalate with more nuclear weapons beyond where we are now?
Although this would certainly seem to be the case, there are in fact 3 more military factors that could come into play at this point, which could cause such a thing to happen. They are called decapitation, launch on warning, and the preemptive strike. And this decapitation is pretty much what it sounds like. It means the cutting off of the head, and thus the eyes and ears and the voice of our military capability.
Or in military jargon, the cutting off of our command, control, and communications. If either side loses its command and control, it would therefore not be able to retaliate in a coherent fashion to the other's first strike.
To use the weapons, in response to, a dedicated attack, you have to face the fact that the whole communications system for relaying the necessary orders may not exist, it may be blown away. The problem is that in a tense situation, rather than letting things go to that end, there could be a very substantial temptation among the responsible U.S. leaders who could start thinking that, well, since we don't have an adequate command and control system for retaliating, rather than letting the other side exploit that weakness, maybe we should make a preemptive attack on the Soviet Union.
People panic when they don't know what's going on and when they feel they're losing control over events. And we, in order both to know what is going on and to maintain control over events, depend on a relatively small number of critical installations, and they are essentially unprotected now. And that's dangerous. And that's particularly true with respect to command and control facilities, some of them in space, many of them in the continental United States.
Now, what are we talking about here? Well, we're talking about a situation where the Soviet leader, the American leader, is getting information in of all kinds, all suggesting the enemy is preparing to attack. The president or the general secretary knows that such an attack is totally absurd. Why do it? It makes no sense. Well, but they're going to do it anyway because that's the way they are. So what does the president or the general secretary do? He sits down with his military people, and the military people say, look, they're going to go first. We have no choice. If we keep waiting, we're going to get hit and that's going to be the end of it. Of course, we can retaliate in the end, but that's not very interesting from our standpoint. Why don't we go first? Who knows what's going to happen? Maybe they'll surrender. Maybe we'll destroy all the linkages to their strategic forces, and even though those submarines are out in the ocean and those bombers are up in the air, they won't get the order to fire. They won't be able to do anything. They'll all go home, or they'll land in somebody else's country, give up, and start growing food. Who knows? So why don't we try it? Why don't we see what happens? What's the worst that can happen? Well, the worst that can happen can't be any worse than if we let them go first. And what's the best that can happen? Unknown. Maybe we'll get away with it. Maybe no one will get killed on our side. Maybe 50 million people will get killed. It's a lot better than what will happen if we just sit here. That kind of logic is what pushes countries to preempt.
Another irony in our story is this. In spite of the thaw in U.S.-Soviet relations, both the U.S. and Soviet Union are continuing to build the very types of nuclear weapons that give a distinct advantage to the side that strikes first. This dangerous strategy of relying on first strike-capable weapons began in the early 70s with America's development and deployment of the MIRV, or Multiple Independently Targetable Re-Entry Vehicle. That's Pentagonese for multiple warheads, multiple Hiroshimas. What MIRVing means is that if fired first, a single missile from side A carrying, let's say, 10 warheads could knock out 10 missiles on side B, and thereby prevent the 10 missiles belonging to side B from coming back at side A. Going first for side A, therefore gives side A a 10-to-1 advantage. And the incentive to go first will be even greater if side A targets its first warheads to decapitate side B's critical command and control facilities. In that case, side A could stop not just 10, but most of side B's deterrent from getting off the ground. This is why these weapons are called first strike weapons, though both sides claim they never intend them for such a purpose. Remember, in the military world of worst-case point of view, it's not what one side says its intention is, but what it can do that counts. And with the advent of the Trident and MX missiles and their Soviet counterparts, the most lethal first strike-capable weapons ever created are now coming off the assembly lines, with a majority of our representatives ready to continue funding more. But the danger of these first strike-capable weapons is not only the incentive they give to the side that goes first, but the enormous pressure they place on the side that believes it is about to be attacked, to launch its missiles before losing its means to command and control them. The use 'em or lose 'em syndrome. This option of launching before certainty of attack, before the warheads actually start exploding, is known as launch on warning. And some have likened this to the hair trigger on a gun.
In terms of a hair trigger, both sides are moving inexorably towards more vulnerability. As one side gets more accurate weapons, the other side's ability to absorb a first strike diminishes. That means that you have computers making a lot of the initial assessments. That means that the President of the United States has to be contacted very rapidly. That means the civilian leadership of this nation has a very short time to make a decision. Now, the ultimate of that, which I hope we have never formally adopted, and I would like to see us never formally adopt, is what's known as the launch on warning policy, meaning that if we believe we're under attack, before we're absolutely certain of that, we may very well launch ourselves, because if we don't, we're in a situation where we lose a lot of our deterrent. That is a very dangerous situation.
The danger of launch on warning is that false information could trigger World War III. That a president or another decision maker could believe that the other side has just launched an attack and could approve or authorize retaliation on the basis of that information, which could prove, if given enough time to sort it all out, to be false.
Day 8, 10:40 p.m.
Repeat, confidence is high.
This is not a test. Repeat, this is not a test. The Soviet Union has just launched an apparent nuclear first strike against the United States. I repeat, this is not a test. Targeting information is now being relayed to us from federal officials at the Alternative National Military Command Center. This is an emergency. This is not a test. Stay tuned to this frequency for further advisories and information.
Roger, understand. Major Reinhardt, we have 12 Sea-Lock ballistic missiles inbound on U.S. now.
If the signals and speculations are correct, the president must act now, or suffer the consequences of a potentially decapitating first strike. If he decides to ride it out, we could lose most of our land-based ICBMs and bombers, not to mention this SAC command center, and lose contact with our submarines as well. The president has less than 5 minutes to make up his mind.
He must decide if the apparent Soviet strike is real or if it is due to human or computer error, or if it is only the missiles launched by a single panicked Soviet submarine commander, or perhaps, in another scenario, by even a French, British, or Chinese sub-commander. Though the launch may not be real, or if real may not be Soviet, President Bush, or if he's incapacitated Vice President Quayle, could decide to launch on warning, rather than risk riding out a decapitating first strike. In spite of the danger of launch on warning, there is reason to believe the military will seriously consider this option in a crisis. Former NORAD Commander General Robert Harries, testifying before Congress.
And we in the military would like to provide the National Command Authority with the with flexibility to be able to ride out at least some portion of a nuclear attack. Unfortunately, we have been able to keep up with the capability to launch on warning, but to go beyond that takes quite a bit of investment.
We will ride out the attack, and I don't care what people say about launch on warning.
I would advise Richard Pearl to convert that view into policy and have it implemented, because we have not pursued a command and control network that would support the policy of retaliation after ride-out. To the contrary, there's tremendous momentum for launch on warning built into our command system. That momentum would be so strong that I doubt whether any individual, including the president, despite his legal prerogative to do so, could resist, could override, could demand that we ride out the attack.
If it's a submarine-launched ballistic missile off of our coast, we have approximate, depending on the distance they're off the coast, but let's say roughly 10 minutes or 12 minutes. That is also adequate time for us to implement our command and control. So a first strike by nuclear weapons is not going to decapitate our command and control.
It seems to me that Admiral Ramsey is suggesting that we're not vulnerable to decapitation because we can implement our command and control procedures before the missiles actually land, 10 to 12 minutes after they're launched. That suggests to me that the option that he's talking about is one of launch on warning.
Don't we have the option, at least, to launch on warning, launch under attack before detonations?
There are many options that can be considered by the President of the United States. Certainly that is an option that can be considered.
Under what circumstances might the commander here at SAC ask the President for permission to launch on warning, or for that matter, to preempt? Under what conditions might that decision be left to the commander himself, or his counterpart flying this moment above us in the looking glass plane? We wanted to ask the commander here at SAC these and other questions, but so far neither he nor anyone else will give us an interview.
10 minutes later.
We interrupt our program for this special report. Soviet television and Radio Moscow are reporting that the United States has launched a massive nuclear attack against the Soviet Union. Secretary General Gorbachev is calling for all Soviet citizens to move immediately to civil defense shelters.
We now end our simulated crisis. We don't really know which side fired the first missile salvo, and had this scenario been real, it's unlikely that anyone would know for certain, much less be around afterwards to tell. You see, the danger of launch on warning is not only if we err, it can be just as tragic for us if Soviet computers err, and they launch to a false warning.
As perverse as it sounds, if the Soviets get to the point where they believe their total force is vulnerable, the world is not safer then. The world is more on a hair trigger. And then we begin depending not simply on our technology and our warning system, but on the accuracy of theirs. Do we want the Soviets sitting there believing that if they don't launch at the first sign of an American attack, even if it's geese flying the wrong way that come through in a malfunction on their machines, do we want to be in a situation where we depend on Soviet technology, a country that has trouble getting elevators to work sometimes, to get that, to have that technology be the crux on which we depend for our survival? The answer is no.
Nearly every decision each side has made in the last 10 years and more has made it more likely that our forces will be on a hair-trigger condition, pressed to launch on warning or to preempt in a serious nuclear crisis. The situation is like that of gunmen in a Western movie, each fearful that if he lets the hand of the other get too close to the holster, it will be too late for him to draw his own weapon. So the incentive is to pull that weapon utmost speed in a tense confrontation and kill or disarm the other person first.
As mentioned at the beginning of the program, there are now 3 basic paths being advocated to lead us to to a more secure future. A short way to describe them would be the following. The first path is to protect the weapons. The second is to minimize the weapons. And the third is to eliminate the weapons. The first path, which we hear a lot about these days, is of course the vast space-borne technological complex called SDI, or the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars.
People who are concerned about making our forces more survivable should be ardent proponents of limited defenses, active defenses. Because active defenses are the only way I know to protect the whole array of critical facilities on land, the missiles, the command and control facilities, and they are essentially unprotected now, and that's dangerous.
Well, Star Wars is the ultimate conclusion of this trend toward the automated computerization of weapons. With Star Wars, there is not time for human intervention. There's not time to get a president out of the shower. There isn't even time for a military officer in a command post to make a rational decision.
The SDI is clearly a complement to a first strike strategy. The side facing SDI will have all the more reason to fear that its opponent may believe that it can escape, not intact, but escape and survive its own first strike. So the plausibility of a first strike by the other side is increased by the existence of SDI. That means our own policies will have put our survival as a hostage to the reliability of Soviet warning systems. It's the most irresponsible decision-making compared to anything else in human history.
Most policy experts believe if we pursue SDI, the Russians would build their own system to match or go around ours. And 95% of scientists polled by the National Academy of Sciences believe SDI won't work anyway. Yet for others, Star Wars represents the final technical fix, the final escalation. They operate on the assumption that nuclear weapons are with us, and they are going to stay with us. There are others who do not accept this assumption, and they offer two alternative solutions. The first solution is called minimum invulnerable nuclear deterrent.
By a minimum invulnerable deterrent, we mean what the word suggests, that it be as small as possible to do the job, that it be invulnerable both in its basing and its ability to penetrate, so that it can be a true deterrent. I would imagine we would get down to something like perhaps 50 weapons on either side. And the perhaps most important thing of all is to imagine the television cameras of the world looking at missiles with hammer and sickle, warheads with stars and stripes painted on them, being turned in for destruction. I think this would be a political move that would be impossible to reverse. And that might be the most important thing of all.
A growing number of other people not satisfied with this last solution and who are concerned about the devastation that even 100 nuclear weapons could cause and about the possession of nuclear weapons by other nations have come up with another solution. Simply get rid of all nuclear weapons, ours, the Soviets, and everyone else's. Can it be done?
And I happen to believe that this will be a lot better world if we get rid of all the nuclear weapons.
It's immoral enough to have nuclear weapons in human hands. But to turn the fate of the Earth over to computers is simply outrageous.
Reverend William Sloane Coffin, president of Sane Freeze, the nation's largest arms control organization.
Our position at Sane Freeze is for the elimination of nuclear weapons, which, after all, is nothing more than President Reagan himself called for. And the reasons are these. If all the nations of the world don't soon take off their military uniform and accept stringent international inspection, then proliferation is going to take place across the face of the globe, and the whole planet will turn into a nuclear porcupine. Now, if Admiral Guy wants to keep 50, fine, let's get down to 50 as soon as possible. Well, but once we're there, why not ask, how about 25? And when you get to 25, why not eliminate all of them?
When people talk about technology getting ahead of the politicians, they're generally talking about nuclear weapons. And it's an argument against nuclear weapons, which seems to me a sort of feckless cry anyway, since they exist and they're going to continue to exist. And the problem is not technology. The problem is the people who make decisions about how to use the weapons at their disposal.
As to Mr. Pearl's argument that there will always be nuclear weapons, that's nonsense. If we go ahead now, verification is possible. If the nuclear powers go ahead with disarmament and accept what's called intrusive verification, they then can turn to the rest of the nations of the world and say, The international inspection we have accepted for ourselves now has to become law for all. The hardest thing about a warless world and believing in a warless world is it hasn't been done. But then nobody thought slavery could be eliminated. It can be done. What's utopian is to view a world without conflict. What is realistic is to view a world without violent conflict, a world where international law will have the same respect as domestic law. And there's one more thing we can do right now. The tripwire, which set off that grisly scenario we saw earlier in the program, could be avoided were the Soviet Union and the United States to agree not to intervene militarily in third world countries.
We need to be asking our government some very hard, direct questions. We're spending billions and billions of dollars on weapons systems that, in fact, may be lessening our security. People often think that they need to be experts in order to have insights into the area of accidental nuclear war, but that simply isn't the case. The important thing with the issue of accidental nuclear war is that the right questions be asked, and the right questions are, will this weapon system make accidental war more likely, or will it make accidental war less likely?
Opinions may vary on these solutions and on the risk of blundering into nuclear war itself, whether now or sometime in the future. Whatever your own position, we believe the questions raised here are urgent, perhaps today more than ever before, as we face another international crisis, extreme instability within the Soviet Union, and the proliferation of other nuclear powers. After all, we would all like to create a world free from the threat of nuclear war, a world where instead of spending so much money on weapons and armies, we could, for example, be solving our serious education, economic, drug, energy, overtaxation, and environmental problems. Today, we have the opportunity to do just that. A time filled with more Soviet and U.S. initiatives, the possibility of a more effective United Nations, and more citizen groups concerned with military spending than ever before in history. Our purpose here is not to advocate any definitive answer, but to stimulate further discussion and also a sense of hope. After all, many of history's greatest accomplishments were called impossible before being done. As the famous anthropologist Margaret Mead once said, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has.
For a reading list, family discussion guide, and information packet, call 1-900-PREVENT. A $3 charge for materials and postage and handling will appear on your phone bill. Or send $3 to Box 1991, Maine Post Office, New York, New York, 10001. Video cassettes are $19.95.
Hello, I'm Martin Sheen. With each passing day, many of us Americans are feeling less and less in control of our lives and of our country. Could things ever get so out of control that we make the ultimate blunder, nuclear war? Could a third world country trigger such a disaster? It could happen. Find out how and what we can do to prevent this. Watch Losing Control.